Welcome back to another edition of the KSL.com Cougar Beat podcast, discussing all things BYU athletics, from football to basketball to women's basketball, track and field we had recently. Shout out to the 6 All-Americans from the NCAA Outdoor Track and Field Championships. We talked to a couple of them last week. You can scroll back in the feed, listen to some of that. But I'm finally going to get back to, I think, what most of you guys have been hammering at me on the internet for, which is, what about football? BYU football is the focal point of the university, the focal point of the athletic department for a lot of fans in their minds. And so I'm finally going to bring you some hashtag football content right now with a discussion with the authors of, well, two very personal associates. I would like to consider them close friends, although they probably have something to say to that. BYU spokesman Brett Pyne, Duff Tittle, thanks for joining the show. Most importantly, the co-authors of 100 Seasons of BYU Football, out now at Deseret Book, the BYU store, Amazon.com, a couple other places like that, but mostly Deseret Book. Gentlemen, thank you for joining the show, for joining the podcast, and welcome, I guess, virtually, that is.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having us on.
Guys, let's dive right into it a little bit, because I've known you guys for a long time. Duff, in particular, I like to joke, is the official, unofficial historian of all things BYU athletics, which is not a slight on his age at all, I promise. It's just the fact that he has been there forever. Brett, a little bit less time at BYU proper, the BYU main campus, but Duff has been there, I think, quite literally forever in some ways. So let's start with you, Duff, and then Brett, jump in with anything you want to add from there. With just what is 100 years of BYU football? I mean, what is kind of the genesis of this project, and maybe why now in particular?
So we, a few years ago, we realized that the 100th season of BYU football was coming up. Football started in 1922, but then it took a pause during the World War II era for 3 years. And so we were trying to do our math and get it correct and found out that it would be the 2024 season. And we'd worked on a couple of books previous to this one about BYU football and had a lot of material that was not used in either of those books, a lot of interviews that we'd done. And we started to kick around the idea of this would be the perfect time to have and kind of overarching, let's look back 100 years of the great moments, players, and historic events that happened throughout that time period.
Yeah, and it was quite a project, a lot of great history, and the legacy of BYU football, I think, is something that a lot of us enjoy, and maybe hopefully through this we'll gain a different appreciation for just all that's gone into making it what it is today.
I love this, and Duff, you touched on this a little bit. I wasn't going to fully go here, but maybe let's dive into kind of that little historical anecdote where this is the 100th season of BYU football, but not necessarily the 100th year because of that break during the Great War. Obviously, when BYU didn't play, and I don't think maybe enough college football fans in general, because BYU certainly wasn't alone for not playing during the war, but certainly I don't think enough maybe BYU fans kind of recognize sort of that break in there. They always just think of it being like this constant, this continual thing, right? And 100 seasons, obviously, BYU football, like it's been a continuous constant for generations on generations like that. But as you were kind of putting together the math of that, was there maybe a little bit of like appreciation for kind of that break, because you were needing to go back and figure out like, okay, what is 100 years? What is 100 seasons sort of thing? And did you learn maybe anything about like that break in particular during the war years that we can start with, and maybe sort of painted your appreciation for BYU football being more than just a football team?
Yeah, I think for sure. Those pre-war years were a little bit rough when it comes to wins and losses. And I
wasn't going to go all the way there, but
yeah,
that's not a lie.
In fact, that season, it was a pretty good season for BYU, particularly the 1942 season, because we beat Utah for the first time. And there's a really there's a great information about that game and what went into that game that we were able to glean through reading people's journals and some records and some history from that time period. So, and then there was the pause for 3 years, and then it was, kind of slow getting going again, just like everywhere around the country was. We were post-war era, and so football was not played in 43, 44, and 45, and then came back in 46. Took a while to get it up and going again. And then I think one of the main things we found out was we had struggled in the win-loss column for years and couldn't figure out why all of a sudden did, we get into the 60s and then things started to get better. And then Lavelle came along, and obviously, the rest is history. But we found a chapter on Ernest Wilkinson, the president of BYU during that time period, and his move to try to get scholarships for athletics, which we weren't aware of. And so there's a really deep, kind of cool reason about why we struggled, because the playing field wasn't level for a long time.
And I'll just add to that, Sean, just one interjection there, as far as you mentioned how that impacted things as far as the war. But, Eddie Kimball was the head coach in the late 30s and through 41. And him and others, the service that they provided to the country, he became the head coach again in 46. And in 42, there was Floyd Millett was the head coach that 1 year right before they took the break in 43, 44, 45. So, there are people that were, in the middle of their profession and doing what they were doing, and they went off to serve our country. So it's definitely an interesting era to look back at and gain a different appreciation for.
Full disclosure, Duff and I have talked about this book kind of off and on a couple of times as you guys were compiling it and writing it and whatnot. And I wanna ask you guys particularly, no book about the history of BYU football, I think, is complete without a significant portion being dedicated to the late great Lavelle Edwards, obviously, rest in peace, coach forever. But I learned from kind of some bits and tidbits and anecdotes that we've talked a little bit about off mic, Duff, that there was a lot going into kind of the rise of BYU football that wasn't even just Lavelle, but Lavelle himself attributed to his direct predecessor, to Tommy Hudspeth, a little bit. And so there's maybe a kind of a unique chapter a little bit on Tommy's role in the rise of BYU football. Is that correct? Am I getting that right?
Yeah, you're right on. Or about the last 20 years, well, not 20 years because Lavelle passed a few years ago, but we had an opportunity to sit down and talk to Lavelle multiple times. And I have some really cool interviews with him where he shared things. One of them was that, Tommy played a big role in his coaching thoughts and philosophies. And he also was the defensive coordinator and on the defensive side of the ball during the time period when Virgil Carter was here and the passing game got its roots. And for 2 seasons was extremely successful. Won a conference championship, just the first one ever at BYU in 1965. And it played a lot into Lavelle's thought process as well. Why were we successful there for a couple of years? And then Virgil, of course, went on to the NFL, and then we kind of started to go back to not throwing the ball as much. So those things were on Lavelle's mind, and he had seen others around the country that had tried it for a little while. Navy did it with Roger Staubach. And then, of course, Jim Plunkett at Stanford had really good success throwing the football. And Lavelle knew a lot of these coaches that had been at these places and had committed to the forward pass. And I think the genius of Lavelle was that he went all in. He realized that if we're going to do this, I can't just get a quarterback and then not have one in the wings. And of course, we all know he created that legacy of All-American quarterbacks and got the thing rolling, and it really changed college football.
How prominent, and I'll ask you this, Brett, how prominent is Lavelle Edwards featured in this book? Because he's obviously kind of this looming, I like to call him not necessarily the grandfather of BYU football, but the godfather of BYU football in a lot of ways. Like, he really was sort of the machinist behind the engine of of what it became into the modern era and leading up obviously to the 1984 national championship and whatnot. But how big of a role is Lavelle kind of featured in this book?
Extremely. I mean, it's if you counted up the number of pages that different people were talked about, Lavelle's going to be the most prominent person in the book, obviously. But I think some will find some fun things in there that maybe they didn't know as much or appreciate as much about Lavelle as well. I mean, there's a photo we have in there when they built the original stadium, Cougar Stadium, which at the time they had had some big players in those early 60s, like the Phantom, Eldon Forti, had been there, and Lavelle had coached him in high school. And when he came in to BYU, he was hired, and to some extent, it's like, hey, here's a coach that knows how to run this type of an offense, this running back that we have, that quarterback / running back, because he would take the direct snap in that formation. But he came along, and there's a picture that we have of the coaching staff when they were promoting and breaking ground for that new stadium, and Lavelle's part of the coaching staff then. And like you've alluded to, that he really credited Tommy Hudspeth for a lot of his growth in his career and learning what to do. So there's parts of that Lavelle was part of that a lot of people don't associate with, because they know him as the head coach when he became the head coach in the 70s. But obviously he's a Hall of Famer. Some of my favorite things too that get touched on. I mean, there's so many iconic moments and people that he was a part of making, so to speak, the famous players, quarterbacks, and the legendary All-Americans and all of that. But as we touched on, and Duff has alluded to this often, but one of the favorite things is how it ended for Lavelle, and kind of the magical way that the players rallied to give Lavelle wins at the end of his career when they needed to, and how he went out in the fashion in which he did, and as a coach, and his influence though continued well beyond that. It was, even as you read into the era that's this more recent era with Kalani, his influence is still there in ways that he reached out to Kalani and to Bronco previous to Kalani, and was an influence on their stewardship of the football program. And we've tried to include some of that in the book as well.
Yeah, when you talk about 100 seasons of BYU football, you think it's this historical piece going back 30, 40, 50, up to 100 years of the program. But it sounds like there's also a pretty good chunk that's kind of dedicated to the modern BYU football, I guess, the Bronco Mendenhall era, the Kalani Sitake era that is current, and that kind of thing. Was there anything that you got out of sort of the modern era, I guess, of BYU football that you included in this book that maybe fans might find most interesting?
That's a great question, and I think it's fair to make sure everybody understands that. Yeah, this covers all of the eras. It's pretty thorough, especially as you get anywhere from the 60s on. It's pretty much every season is being looked at in one form or fashion. And so I think for me, it's like you really look at the way that these coaches and athletes contributed to build the brand of what BYU football has become. And it's not something that any one person, they kind of built on the shoulders of those before them, through some of the things that happened with Coach Croton as well, and all of those things came in and were built, and the way, and some of the synergy that took place, and the way that the players came together, and like the independence era building to a point where we could be in a position to join the Big 12 conference, for example. And it's, Sean, I think the one thing that really strikes me in all this, when you research it and you talk to people, is there are so many people that were part of this and played legitimately significant roles in it. And sometimes it's not people that anyone knows about, and there's people that were on the team that were very important people on the team. And it's hard to talk about everyone in a book like this that covers so much territory. But we tried to list people where we could and do things to give the kind of recognition I think that they all deserve, because they really all have been part of making BYU football what it is.
I think I know where you're going there. So shout out to Shirley. We'll leave it at that. The real brains behind Lavelle's operation in a lot of ways.
Shirley did get a mention. Yes.
I think one of the things we tried to do in the process of this was, we've been here since the mid 90s. So we know a lot of the people that have come through the last 25 years of the program, and had the opportunity to talk to a bunch of them. And then we tried to go backwards too. And I know we tried to tell these stories through their eyes, so that we're not just rehashing, the scores and the touchdowns and the interceptions and all that, but really what was going on the sidelines, what was going on in the huddle, what were the conversations that were happening amongst the players, what were their thoughts about various things. We interviewed former coaches and administrators, and tried to be really thorough to tell the story through their eyes, and not necessarily just, some historical newspaper story or, something that we have in our archives, but really, what was happening on the field at the time when that drive happened or that play happened.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to kind of get you guys out of here. And again, I really appreciate you joining me to kind of talk about this book and some of the experiences that you had putting it together. Again, that's 100 Years of BYU Football by Duff Tittle, Brett Pyne, out now. Deseret book, BYU store, Amazon.com, among other places. It is available now in time for Father's Day. So if you're like me and you procrastinated getting dad a gift, this might be a good option as well. And just to kind of wrap it up, was there anything that you guys learned, any particular story or anecdote, historical footnote, maybe something like that you didn't really know before, but you think like, okay, this is the reason that I wrote the book. Like, this is one of the kind of the key reasons to get that book out of there. Was there like a story or a person that you learned about or anything like that maybe you don't mind sharing to sort of preview the book? I don't want to give away too much, if you can't tell. I'm trying not to give away too much of the book so that BYU fans can go and pick it up and read it and dive through it, maybe sit it next to their nightly scripture study, and that kind of thing. But was there kind of one moment where you were like, this was worth everything right there?
Well, I'll jump in, and just Duff will have something too. But one of the moments that was intriguing for me, and I think a lot of people wouldn't have an appreciation for, but the early era Lavelle, when they were struggling a little bit and off to a slow start, and the players basically taking ownership of the program, had a players only meeting where they got together and said, "Hey, coach, we'd like to do this." And they really kind of rallied themselves and brought themselves together, and then finished strong. And that season, they ended up going to the first bowl game, which is 50 years ago this year. And some of those little small things like that you kind of are able to dive into and find out more about, I think have a significant impact on how things go, but you don't realize it so much at the time. And maybe they're not well known to, because it wasn't a game, for example. But that, to me, those kinds of things that you learn are really kind of intriguing and speak to really what kind of goes on in a program.
I think to add on to that, it kind of from that same era is, I listened to some of the old interviews I'd done with Lavelle. There was a weaving of names that had gone through the program or that had influenced his decision making, and guys like Doug Scoville and Dewey the Swamp Rat Warren, and then even Bill Walsh. He talked about how Bill had influenced some of his thinking, and they were in communications with each other, and Bill was trying to do something similar in the NFL that Lavelle was trying to do at the collegiate level. And there was just these intertwines of the same people and names coming up through the research. And we tried to really tell that story of Lavelle's genius and going all in, with the pass. And in many ways, we've talked to people at ESPN and Sports Illustrated who told us that the amazing part about it is that he went all in, right? That he was going to live or die with the pass and because of that, that's what probably made him successful, in that he was committed to it and went all in. So this obviously covers several chapters. There's a whole era of maybe 15 years where you see that thing unfold, and Andy Reid and Mike Holmgren and others that came, Brian Billick, that went on to be successful as NFL coaches. There's a really kind of cool storyline, I guess, that's underneath all the chapters that I think is my favorite part.
Yeah. I feel like there's a life lesson in there somewhere that, I mean, again, may you rest in peace, but Coach Edwards still teaching us life lessons to this day about, like, whatever you do, go all in. Don't just go halfway in, because you never know if you're going to be a legend in your line of work for this little change that you're making, something that seems so obvious to you at the time and suddenly becomes, revolutionary in the way that Coach Edwards, I think, revolutionized college football in a lot of ways.
Sean, that's a really good. I love the fact that you said that, because I think in so many ways, just being around him and watching how he treated others, how he went about his day, his activities, I learned more about being a good person and a good human being from just observing him in the few years I had the opportunity to work with him than maybe just about anything else I've ever learned from any one particular person, other than my parents, of course.
Yeah.
And I'll add to that, we talked and mentioned some things that Patty Edwards has done and left a legacy on college football, not just BYU football, but college football. And, she's such an important part of the whole Edwards family. I mean, they were, you talk about Lavelle being such a great person, but, that's kind of a collective with Patty and their whole family, and such great leaders and stewards for the program. And it's fun to have that and others that have come along, and even some of the interactions, the way that Kalani and his wife have really in a lot of ways echo kind of what the Edwards were like, and how their culture of the program and the way that things are done now. So it's fun to see some of those things kind of tie together and see how that narrative and that history kind of can come together when you've actually researched all the way through and see how one thing builds on another.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. That's great. Well, once again, the book is 100 Years of BYU Football. Brett Pyne, Duff Tittle, thank you guys so much for joining me to talk a little bit about the process, the work, the memories, the experiences of this book. It's out now at Deseret Book. Go pick up your copy. It's a really good coffee table book, I've noticed as well. Like, it's not like a normal novel, serialized novel of any kind. It's like, it actually it's not only thick and packed with historical info, but it looks like a thick historical type of not novelization. That would be the opposite of what I'm trying to get at, but just collection. It has this bibliothèque feel to it in a lot of ways. It's the kind of the library of 100 years or 100 seasons, I guess, of BYU football in a lot of ways. Duff, Brett, thanks so much for joining me to talk about it. Really appreciate it. And let's catch up a little bit later, because Brett probably has the exact countdown, I'm sure, hanging somewhere in his office, but I think we're like 50 days away from kicking off the 2024 football season.
It's coming, Sean. It's coming.
Yeah, way too soon for some of us. But you know what? More football, better football. So again, that's 100 Years of BYU Football by Brett Pyne, Duff Tittle, out now at Deseret Book, BYU Store, Amazon.com, and a couple of other places. Thanks again, guys, for joining me to talk about this venture.
Thank you, Sean. Appreciate it.
Thanks, see you.